This is Squat the Lot, Squatters' Culture and Politics in Hackney in the 1980s. I don't know quite why I ended up doing this, but I'm CHAS Loft. I did squat in Hackney in the 1980s, so I guess I've got some qualification. And I'm going to be assisted by Gail Thibert, Charlotte Pink and Heather Redheader, who are going to talk about their experiences. I'm going to try and give a kind of overview of the background to squatting in Hackney in the 1980s and a sort of whistle-stop tour of culture and politics and squatting. When I was asked if I wanted to do this, I thought there's a lot of people who'd be better than me, and so I contacted one of them, a guy who was always there to supply electricity to squatted centres and help out, and he said, sorry, it doesn't really interest me being a historical spectacle for Hackney's colonisers, but good luck with it. And I wanted to start with that because I hear what you're saying, but I think if we don't talk about these things, this history gets lost. And I don't want my kids to grow up thinking the only world is the one where you work 40 hours a week to pay off your student loan and your rent. And if there's one lesson of squatting in Hackney in the 1980s, it's that another world is possible. So on that happy note, and with a picture of the squatters of Laura Place behind us, let's get going. So in terms of background, squatting's an ancient right, but you'll be glad to know I haven't gone back before 1946. There was the first wave of post-war squatting was people spontaneously squatting disused army bases in 1946, and the Communist Party tried to lead that to jump on the bandwagon by squatting some luxury flats in Kensington, and that produced a government backlash and the communists sort of backed out. But the squatting of army bases got widespread support because obviously there was a massive housing crisis after the war, and a lot of those bases endured for quite a long time. And in fact, the Daily Mail praised the self-reliance and common sense of the squatters. It's well known as the squatter's friend. So then the second wave of squatting in London was really in the 1960s, and it was sort of depended upon the fact that in the 60s there were big plans to modernise bits of London, and whole areas got compulsory purchased and cleared of residents in preparation for new roads or new housing estates. But the clearing out of people seemed to go a lot quicker than the actual building. And so you ended up, this is in London Fields, that none of those houses are there anymore, the road's still there. And so you had whole swathes of London that were becoming abandoned. And during this time, there were a number of campaigns that sought to get local people on the housing list into these empty properties and then persuade councils to grant them short life tenancies. And generally speaking, those campaigns were pretty successful. And in 1977, the GLC announced a squatters' amnesty. So one feature of this phase of squatting was a tension between the people who were primarily concerned with campaigning around homelessness and getting councils to give people tenancies, and the people who wanted to see squatting as the first step in an alternative way of life. And the people who were primarily concerned with housing saw those people as potentially putting councils off doing a deal with squatters, and the people who wanted an alternative way of life weren't necessarily interested in what the councils thought. Professor Christine Wall of Westminster University, who's a former squatter, has written an account of how in London Fields, where whole streets had been cleared for demolition, squatting allowed the creation of a base for radical feminist and lesbian squats and pioneered women-only housing alongside mixed squats as well. And Professor Wall sees this as an important and revolutionary moment. And I'm just going to quote what she says about it. It allowed lesbian women to live openly and move freely within the neighbourhood streets. It was in some senses utopian, an opportunity for self-determination, to live autonomously, to imagine and create a different world. Young lesbians exerted a newfound confidence in a right to the city by reshaping empty houses and found materials into an environment they designed and lived in. Oh, I've got one here, Gail. Oh, can you? Right, okay, sorry. So basically, this was squatting as more than just finding housing for people. And it's interesting to note that by the 1980s, actually that should say 1980s, sorry, Brougham Road in London Fields was a sort of centre for the local alternative music scene. It was a base for several bands, a record label, there was a recording studio in it. And there's a whole web page about this. And the guy who wrote it had lived in Brougham Road in the 80s, but admitted he didn't know anything about how it came to be squatted. So even though that was only less than 10 years after what Professor Wall was talking about, it just goes to show how easily these histories can be lost. And if you want to appreciate why my friend responded so bitterly to my request that he do this instead of me, you could Google the battle around Tony's Cafe and Spirits Shop in Broadway Market in the early 2000s, and the sort of way in which that area has completely changed from the alternative community that dominated it for so long. So by the 1980s, I think there weren't these sort of swathes of places that had been set aside for demolition, and squatters tended to live either in flats in council estates or in houses like this one, where I used to live in Stamford Hill, which had been converted from big Victorian houses to flats in the 1950s, and then basically the council couldn't manage its housing stock. The influx of ex-GLC properties in the 80s doubled Hackney's housing responsibility at a time when cuts made it harder to manage that housing responsibility. The house that I lived in, the back wall was falling away from the rest of the house, so there's a sort of gap of a couple of inches between the ceilings and the back wall. The roofs were held up internally by acro props. It wasn't something that, it needed a complete rebuild, basically. And that was fairly typical of the houses that were being squatted, I think, in the 80s. I want to tell you one anecdote about this house, which was that our main source of hot water was a twin tub. So you could put cold water in it, it would heat it up, and then you get it to pump it out into the bath. But that took forever, and so people tended not to want to hang around and watch it. And when the Homely Road estate around the corner was evicted, I knew a guy who ran an anarchist publishers, and he said, I've got 200 boxes of valuable anarchist publications and I'm going to be evicted. Can I store them at your house? And we were halfway through putting them from a car into the hall when somebody had been running this bath apparatus, hadn't stayed to supervise it, and the hose fell off the side of the bath and poured boiling water onto the floor of the bathroom, creating a waterfall of boiling plaster onto our priceless anarchist book collection. It was like Pompeii. But no anarchists were harmed, and the publications survived, I'm glad to say. Just to give you some figures, in 1981, Hackney had 2,300 empty properties. By 1988, a third of council properties, that's 13,000, were either unfit for living in or lacked basic amenities or needed basic repairs. In 1990, there were an estimated 3,500 squats in Hackney. That's squats, not squatters. But by 1993, there were only 1,500 squatters. So there was, I would say the peak was the mid-80s, and there was a sharp decline in the 90s. And of course, when people talked about squatters, they tended to talk about people who looked like squatters, but a lot of those people might not actually live in squats. And then there were a lot of people squatting who didn't necessarily look like squatters. And there were a lot of people who you would assume were council tenants, but it wasn't their name on the rent book. So housing was it was in a chaotic state. So one of the things I wanted to highlight, this was my friend's Bender in the back of a squat in 1984. He came back from Stonehenge and thought, oh yeah, I want to live in a tent. That's in the back garden. The old lady next door used to bring him tea in the morning. I wanted to talk about culture and squatting, and the best way to do it quickly is just to show these are the places that I remember, and I know that I've missed some during the time I was in Hackney. And you can see there's a sort of 10, 15-year period where there was always some squatted centre somewhere. And they were a mixture of old nightclubs, old pubs, or just large buildings like Lee House or this place, the Blue House. So these places put on gigs, but they all had aspirations to be cultural and political centres. So a lot of them were bases for political groups. They almost always tried to provide vegetarian cafes, which was quite rare at the time. Lee House on Amherst Road, I think it's on, no, Rectory Road, but where Rectory Road and Amherst Road meet, had a skateboard ramp for local kids, a bookshop, and was the base of active distribution and anarchist and punk literature publishers that carried on for years after Lee House had gone. The Lido hosted raves, a cafe, a rehearsal and recording studio, a vegetable patch. It was the base for London Reclaim the Streets, and in 1998 there was the Carnival of the Dispossessed there, which was a benefit for Reclaim the Streets. And so I've got some slides. To me, the Blue House was the jewel in the crown of Hackney's entertainment empire. Christine Grace, whose photos these are, she's German, she's in Germany now, but she was one of the original squatters. She said that they wanted to find a building and paint it blue and call it the Blue House, but when the building they found turned out to be a Tudor mansion, they thought they'd better not. This was the gig venue, and when they moved in, it was still subdivided because it had been a trade union office. And it always strikes me that, was it a trade union office and then left empty because the National Trust at the time thought there was no point in having a Tudor house open to the public in Hackney, or is there some other explanation? But certainly the squatting of it provided the catalyst for the fact that we've now got a Tudor house open to the public in Hackney. And the thing that I most fondly remember about it was the courtyard, because there was no better place to have a hangover than just sitting in the courtyard after a good night. And I wanted to use this particular poster because this is a benefit for a political demonstrations bust fund. Get the benefit for the bust fund before you have the arrests is a good bit of advice. But it shows that these places were inherently political. They weren't just about somewhere to have parties. And this is a band from Munich playing here. I wanted to use this one because it's the only photo that I could find that actually showed sort of what it looked like as a gig venue. And I'm standing where the singer is, basically. And this shocked me because I played here and I thought they had a stage, but I was paid in cans of Tennent's Super, so that's probably why I thought I was on the stage. And then this is an advert for the Black Bull, which was a squatted pub in Haggerston. And what I chose this one because it's actually an advert for the vegetarian cafe. It's not for a gig or anything. And that's the Carnival of the Dispossessed that took place in the Lido in 1998. And these are press cuttings about the skate ramp for local kids that was at Lee House. When Lee House was evicted, they got some press coverage about that. So, as I say, there was always a sort of political and cultural wider agenda than just having someone to have a party. So in terms of politics, it made me laugh when the poll tax riot happened in Hackney and they talked about outside agitators coming to Hackney. Hackney is where the outside agitators live. And particularly in the 1980s, might not be now, but in the 1980s it was. And squatters were involved in all sorts of political activity that lots of other people were involved in, like the Wapping pickets, Stop the City, the campaign against the poll tax. But there were regular protests about housing. So this is 1981, Sherry's Wharf was a GLC development that was supposed to be for the residents of Kingsmead Estate, but was put on the market at prices local people couldn't afford. So it was squatted in protest for a couple of months in 1981. And this other one is one of the regular Hackney Squatters' Aid protests against evictions in the early 90s. And then we'll come back to this actually, but that's the Stamford Hill Estate eviction. So in the late 80s, the unlikely base for political activity, at least in the north of Hackney, was the Homely Road Estate in Stamford Hill, where the Hackney Solidarity Group had squatted Oxted Court, which was an entire low-rise block that was empty because there was something fundamentally wrong with it. I think it was sinking. And that's a picture from the eviction of it in 1991. The Hackney Solidarity Group ran a really effective local anti-poll tax union, which, right, that's my alarm, so I'm now on borrowed time. Oh, Christ, sorry about that. Yeah, so they'd actually taken over the advertising hoarding by the newsagent in Dunsmuir Road, and every Saturday there was a poll tax stall there selling T-shirts and mugs and encouraging people to register for the poll tax so they'd know you weren't paying it, because basically people's attitude was, well, I don't pay the rates, so why am I going to pay the whole poll tax? That's the kind of place we're talking about. And then they also published a Hackney Heckler, and this issue is about the keys for, or the cartoon is about the keys for cash scandal. And what that was there were some Hackney Housing Department managers who were fraudulently marking flats as uninhabitable and then renting them out to people and pocketing the rent. And this was exposed by a squatter on Woodbury Down Estate who became suspicious at how quickly the council were allocating empty flats. It was too efficient. And so he I mean, I'm not exaggerating, he then conducted his own brilliant undercover investigation by pretending to be one of the people who was allocated a flat and established what was going on, and went to the Director of Housing at Hackney Council. A few days later, he was approached in the pub and offered £800 in cash and a flat for life if he said nothing. When he refused, at 3 o'clock in the morning, some guys with baseball bats kicked his door in and attacked his girlfriend because they got to her first, and he fought them off with a crowbar. The Director of Housing, I'm not saying that she was guilty of anything, but she moved to Brazil shortly afterwards, which is it's not a good look, is it? And there was a £250,000 investigation that led to 5 employees being sacked and several suspended, but no criminal charges. And then finally, the other thing, which I'm going to deal with very quickly, was squatters and the police. Being a squatter in Hackney, it wasn't just squatters this happened to, and the majority of cases that Hackney Community Defence Association, who I worked for, dealt with involved black kids and black adults. But being a squatter in Hackney meant that if you were out in the wrong time in the wrong place, you could literally just be grabbed, falsely charged or beaten up, and end up with a criminal record for having done nothing. And there's a really good account somewhere online of this. After 1991, HCDA started taking up squatters' cases, including one at the Neville Arms, where 9 people were arrested. Everybody ended up being acquitted. And I'm going to condense this, but the upshot was that in 1998, 7 police officers went on trial at the Old Bailey for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice and assault, including torturing squatters inside Stoke Newington Police Station. Only one of them ended up getting convicted and sent to prison. The others were all kicked out of the police. And the reason they got off was because the CPS didn't call the 8th police officer who'd been part of that group and had left the police and given a statement to the police complaints verifying all the squatters' allegations of torture, assault and wrongful arrest. So squatters' attempts to fight back did help clean up a bit Stoke Newington Police. So I'm not going to take up more time because I want other people to have a chance to speak. I'm going to leave you with this classic Hackney Gazette squatters coverage, and the picture below is part of a model that's in the London Museum. I don't think it's on display at the moment, but it used to be, which is a model of Ellingfort Road and London Lane made by one of the squatters there during the successful campaign to persuade the council to give them licences in, I think, the early 90s. So I'm going to go back to my slide about the eviction of Stamford Hill Estate and invite Charlotte Pink to tell us a bit about what was a 3-day standoff between the police and squatters over the eviction of 120 flats. So over to Charlotte.
I'm just going to start by saying I've got a few photos that I can hand around and people can come and look at afterwards that I took at Stamford Hill Estate of the police at 5 in the morning in their riot gear coming in to evict us. Basically, I wasn't actually living on the estate at the time. I was staying there over the 3-day barricade to support the squatters that were living there. And there was a whole group of us squatting around sort of Woodbury Downs and in Green, and we kind of travelled up in solidarity, basically. And yeah, they literally, the squatters got some cars and blocked the roads, and we barricaded ourselves into the estates. No one could come in, no one could come out in vehicles. And we literally barricaded ourselves into the squats as well. So we were like boarded up inside. And then, like I say, the police turned up at 5 o'clock in the morning and did a dawn raid and came with all sorts of equipment and literally broke down the doors, like literally just smashed windows. There were families with kids there. It was really quite scary. It was quite, actually, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. It wasn't a pleasant time. And I think it was, those days, it was like the police were colluding with the council to kind of stop squatting. I had a lot of personal experiences where you'd be in a squat, and you know, I remember one squat in Green where I was actually paying bills, you know, we paid the gas and electric. The police turned up with somebody from the council and said that we weren't paying. We had no evidence because we didn't have paperwork at the time, we'd only just signed up for it. And they literally chucked us out then and there. We didn't even have time to get our possessions. They just kicked us out, and then they went and smashed every single plug point, every, like, the toilet, the basins, the bath, everything in the house so that we couldn't move back in, and boarded the place up, and I had to break back in to get my possessions out. And they smashed up the washing machine that the neighbours had given us. You know, it was tough times. And Stamford Hill was on the news because it was a big deal. There was a lot of squats that got evicted that week. And it was kind of almost like the start of the end of the squatting scene as far as I'm concerned, because it just got so tough to squat after then. And nowadays you can't actually legally squat private property anymore. And I don't even know if you can squat commercially now.
I think you can still do commercial.
I think some commercial properties could be squatted, but you know, we lived in squalid conditions. We kept those houses. We did those houses up a lot of the time. We kept them sort of in a state that somebody could live in them. We housed ourselves rather than live on the streets. And it was a sense of community as well. I do think that was for me, that was a really big part of it, especially being a sort of single woman, lesbian, in sort of Haringey, Hackney. It gave me a sense of community, and everyone supported everyone else. We had all the squat cafes like Lee House, and there was connections all over London. There was, like, you know, squats in South London, there was squats in Waterloo that had like gigs and cafes, and Old Kent Road, I remember, and yeah, it was a good time, but it was a tough time. I don't know, that's what I have to say really. And I was one of the witnesses against the police and got PC evidence sent down. I was on the stand for a day and a half being cross-examined about what I saw that night. And I've got a few newspaper cuttings as well with me if anybody wants to look at them.
So we're going to hand over to Gail Thibert now to talk about her experiences.
Thanks. I won't go on and on and on, unless you want to sleep. So I wrote a book a few years back called Sober Stamps Jump the Tube, which is currently out of print. It's sold out. I'm hoping to get it reprinted. But I did write about my experiences squatting, 2 of which were in Hackney. And CHAS says that he squatted the same house after I moved out. And when I first moved to Skiverdale Road, I was 19. And at that time, I didn't have a job. I couldn't raise a deposit. I wasn't getting on with my parents. I was very vulnerable. And because somebody said, I've got a room in a squat, I was like, great, fantastic. I didn't have to think about savings or anything like that. So it was immediately accessible. My room had a mushroom in it. Not oh great, not the kind of fungi I was looking for. So I had to deal with this fungus. And yes, we had to deal with quite squalid conditions. And I think anyone who's ever squatted, it makes you grateful for running water, whether it's hot or not, just grateful for running water, grateful for a roof over your head, Grateful for a roof that doesn't have dead pigeon legs sticking through it, which I have experienced. And I actually grew up in the suburbs, and I got a lot of stick from very conservative people saying, how dare you take somebody's house? You're stopping somebody from living there. I was like, do you not think I need somewhere to live too? And I would have loved to have had a deposit. I would have loved to be able to choose where I was living. But unfortunately, we were a lot of people in circumstances that we were emergency. Went to the council at 16. They told me that I wouldn't get housed until I was 30-something. And that's a long wait when you're 16, you know. So there wasn't the help, there wasn't the support, so we were DIY. By not having to have a job and pay the rent, it opened us up to a lot of creativity. We had the time to be artists, to be musicians. Me and CHAS have been in a band together, and we played here. Where you're sitting, we played here. And you know, I came to lots of gigs here and sat out in that courtyard, and earlier I was sitting there just really reminiscing on it, and some of the people who sadly are no longer with us. But certainly this idea that we were taking people's houses, like has already been mentioned, we kept places alive. I remember squatting in one place where there were still a couple of residents living there. It was old railway buildings, and they were grateful for us because we were respectful squatters. We cleared places out, we cleared them of the rubbish, we did them out, we paid our bills, and it stopped whole rows being demolished, and those tenants, long-term tenants, were able to live there a lot longer. So yeah, up the squatters.
Thanks, Gail. And finally, we've got Heather Redheader. It's Heather's birthday today, so you're lucky to have her. So I hope you appreciate it. There was some slides for Heather.
Okay, let's just go on it. So I came to squatting. I moved to Hackney in '88. I had a friend who knew someone. It's like a way in. How do you get into these places? I had a friend who knew someone, and I ended up getting a room in a huge big house, and there were two houses set back from the road along Green Lanes, 293 Green Lanes, and it was just opposite John Scott Health Centre. The building is not there anymore, but it was like these huge kind of buildings, and I think they were like mother and baby units in the 70s, so that each floor had like separate rooms, big rooms and a small room with a sink, and then there would be a bath in the hall that everyone shared. There was no hot water. And there were like 3 floors. We had kind of like a very mix of people there. There were people from like the valleys, South Wales, mechanics. The gardens first of all started being kind of like places where all the cars would get dumped and tatted and sorted out. And models were living there. We had some Irish nurses on the 2nd floor. It was a real mix of people. My dad actually came to visit me once, and he was just kind of like astounded at the mix of people and how friendly everyone was. You know, my parents are they live in a village in Wales, so the only idea of squatting is like EastEnders and Mary from EastEnders, who had like, you know, newspaper on the floor and then corrugated iron over the windows. It's like, and we had like really lovely houses. I mean, yeah, they were falling down and they didn't have any hot water, but they were, you know, kind of like communally really beautiful. You know, we'd eat together. The thing about living in big houses for me as a mother, was the fact of like the community and the support that I got when I was on my own. I didn't really know that many people that had, I didn't know anyone really that hadn't had children at the time. And the fact that I could get the support from other people around me was huge, rather than like living on my own and isolated. The fact that I wasn't allowed to have my child at home because we didn't have hot water was something that was problematic. But the fact that I could have that space and it was, you know, relatively clean and yeah, being able to be around people was important. I lived in a room, and then eventually I ended up moving into a caravan in the back garden. So the cars ended up leaving, and then the kind of like hippies moved in, I guess you could say. So a lot of people that were at the Beanfield, which is where the police kind of smashed everyone's houses and annihilated loads of people's buses and homes, came to kind of Hackney, and so quite a few people moved into the back garden, and I ended up leaving my bedroom and having my first home, which is like this beautiful old wooden caravan, which is probably worth grams now. I think it's about 100 quid, in the back garden. And then this woman had a child as well, and some other people moved in and they had kids. So it was just this whole like community of children where, you know, I remember my son's second birthday, and we had like cake and everyone was tea parties and everyone came out. It was just really lovely. So I think the fact of like, again, this kind of mixing of people, you know, for me is really important, and I don't know where you can get that nowadays. The fact that we were lucky to live in a place where there was a diversity of, I don't think it started, a diversity of people, like from all different backgrounds. So I lived with someone who went to Eton, there's someone else on the scene that's like a lady, there's people that could left care, that never had any, and a home to talk of. So there was a lot of dynamics, a lot of people with a lot of issues, and I think the fact of like living in these big houses was, we found a community, we found support from each other. That there isn't there anymore. People are more and more isolated and more individualised, rather than being able to support each other, and especially having a child doing that. So this idea of the sort of squatter traveller scene was kind of like huge to me. I ended up kind of going off and doing that once I left London, travelling around. And again, we were able to do this because of the huge houses that were just left empty. The property prices were like absolutely desolate in the 80s. There was a lot of big houses around in Hackney, and a lot of them were falling apart. So we were moving in and doing them up. We were really lucky to have that space to do that. From like 82, I think, to 88, the property prices rose by 80%. But this is this idea of like, all of a sudden it became, people all started wanting their old ruins back, and we kind of kept them up, and all of a sudden like you're out, and there's new people in. The idea of, it seemed weird because there were a lot of Scots that didn't kind of get evicted, and it always seemed to be that they were all the really together Scots, where it was like living community and sharing food and all that, kind of were getting evicted a lot more. And then the problematic Scots, where there was kind of a lot of drug use and police issues, ended up being there forever. So I don't know what that was all about. The idea of eating communally as well. So a lot in Green Lanes, especially, we had, which is not really heard of in the 80s. We used to go skipping for food, so we used to go into skips outside shops before they put bleach on stuff, and get food. There was a run that we used to do in Green Lane, so someone would go to Marks and Spencer's, and we'd get all the out-of-date stuff from Marks and Spencer's, and luckily enough it came to our house first, so we got like top pickings of all the really nice stuff. And then it went off to when it drove off to all different spots around the area. This is kind of something they do now, but at the time it was quite unusual. I think I like the idea of like raising a child with this kind of idea of like having people around me. It wasn't just me telling him off, it was like this shared responsibility, this idea that being around adults and being treated not so much as a child, but being taught to being part of the community, which I think is hugely important. I think I like end on the fact that, again, I think talking about community, how important it is. The fact that we found our tribe, we have all these kind of like people from different backgrounds, maybe not fitting in, and you found your family, you know. If you didn't have one at home, you found a place, and you found a place to be and feel safe, despite, you know, the fact of being evicted, or the scaredness of like knowing that you could get evicted any time. I've had like been woken up in the middle of the night with a police torch in my face. It is quite terrifying. And the idea, you know, the ideas that people have about squatters, when, you know, the reality is very different. But being able to, I guess, support each other is important. I just want to say, like, I was at the Neville Arms. I haven't actually told my son that there's photos of him here. Sorry, Jane. I was at the Neville Arms when it got raided, so and we had a file which I found actually, and again that's the reminder of like these places that were kind of put together. And there was nothing so organised, but it was like Sunday nights, so we had like a food shop, so we'd all take turns making a huge, you know, pot or bucket or dustbin of falafel mix or whatever, slop, you know, that would come, and it would be a place where we could come and mix, not so much party or get off your head or something like that. It was just being able to like share food together and mix with each other in these spaces like old pubs, which was very beautiful. So this is my back garden of Green Lanes. We had huge, we had that for a while. There's still the remnants of the cars. And we ended up having like a big bouncy castle, not bouncy castle thing, a trampoline as well. And then we had more people moving in, so we didn't kind of have much space for that. But I think that's it really. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. I think maybe we just let those carry on while we, excuse me, if anybody's got any questions, the squatters panel here be happy to, just don't ask us how to break into the town hall and live there or something like that. Or maybe. Yes, while you're thinking of questions, please do have questions. While you're thinking of them, I wanted to say that a lot of the stuff in my talk came from a website called The Radical History of Hackney, which is a fantastic website that's got lots of original documents for all sorts of radical projects that went on from, I think, the 60s to the 90s and beyond. So I'd encourage you, if you're interested, go and have a look at that. And the other thing I wanted to plug was I got some of the more ancient history from a guy who, bear with me, Dr. Sam Burgum. This unlucky guy has got a grant to write a history of squatting in London. And his book, which is called Squatting London, The Politics of Property, is out in December. I don't know whether it'll be any good, but the stuff on his website's pretty good, and he's a professional historian, so at least somebody's writing about it. Janet.
So I understand that the furniture in the squatters' room upstairs belonged to you. Is that correct? Could you elaborate?
Yeah, I think most of it is mine. So about 10 years ago, there was a woman called Roxanne Stephen who worked at something called Praxis, which I'm not sure if it was squatted or what, but it was like an arts collective up by Stoke Newington Railway Station. And Roxanne ran a project to try and an oral history project on squatting, and she interviewed quite a lot of us, and the interviews are in the Hackney Archive. I tried to get her to come and speak here, but I haven't been able to. She hasn't answered her messages, so hopefully she's okay somewhere. I didn't know her. And somehow, as a result of that, we got in touch with the National Trust, and at the same time, the band that I was in the 80s, who I'm sure you've all heard of, called Flowers in a Dustbin. We were supposedly, I'm not sure it's true, but it claimed that we were the first band to play at the Blue House. So we went to Sutton House and said, could we play to celebrate the 30th anniversary of it being squatted, and we played here in whatever that was, 2015. And then they started saying they wanted some furniture, and I still had some junk. But it is, the bookcase up there I got from Barclays at Stamford Hill, and had in my room for a very long time. And I think there's some copies of Vague and a Mob album cover and various other furniture that was genuine squatters' artifacts. And the great thing about it was when I gave it to them, they said that I had to fill out this form, and so it's now like all of that stuff is officially part of the National Trust collection, along with all the Rubens and the whatever else they've got at the posh houses. But yeah, so I think most of it is mine.
So if people haven't been to the squatter room, I really recommend it. That's upstairs.
I think you can always spot an ex-squatter. Sorry, beg your pardon. You can always spot an ex-squatter when you walk past a skip. An ex-squatter cannot walk past a skip without looking inside or possibly crawling inside. And it was many years in my kind of rehabilitation of not being able to bring stuff back into the house, you know, because I would see like abandoned desks and things and like, right, you know, I'm having that. And, you know, I suppose in a way we were the early recyclers, and this thing that, was it, brain's gone. Heather was saying about the redistribution of food, you know, but now we've got Too Good To Go, we've got Olio, we've got all these apps where it's kind of trendy to recycle, to not recycle food, but to stop waste. You know, but exactly that. We didn't have money, so we were going into skips and finding stuff. And this story of how bleach was poured on food to stop you taking it. And I can remember working in Sainsbury's, maybe sort of 15 years ago, and the waste was outrageous, these bags of day-old bread, and I said, can't you just give it to the pensioners? Can't you just give it away? Oh no, they would rather crush it. Absolutely disgusting. So, yeah.
Yes, hi. Right, as someone who may or may not have sat through some pretty interminable meetings for left-wing groups, in my time, I am interested in how the sort of more community-minded Scots made decisions, and how whether it was meetings or it was a lot more informal than that, but as a group of people who sort of come together, how did you sort stuff out and decide things?
It was fairly informal, I think. People were talking to the mic. I think it was fairly informal. Like, say with the cafes, I mean, in Lee House, for instance, they would put a rotor up on the wall, you just sign up, and then you just go in and, you know, assign a task to each other. Like, you know, somebody would like chop up the vegetables, somebody was good at cooking, somebody was good at baking would bake, you know, I don't know, it just kind of happened. I don't think there were like meetings or committees or anything like that. It was just a group of friends go, oh yeah, should we go down to Sainsbury's to see the bins tonight, see if there's anything in there, you know. We had a women's cafe as well called the Wank Cafe, women's act up nuisance cafe, and we used to go skipping, and then just a group of us would get together in the kitchen and take it in turns to cook and do washing up or do entertainment. We'd have like put on performances or run a little ritual for spring or something, you know. It was kind of organic.
Yeah, I think organic's a really great word for it. I think I mean, I wasn't involved directly in any centre, but I sort of knew people. Sorry, I've got one on. Two double mics. But yeah, I think organic is the right term for it. I was always put off by, later on, I sort of had dealings with, you know, I remember there was an attempt to bring all the radical political groups in Hackney together in the early 90s, And they spent like hours arguing about what should be in the constitution about how society should be constructed after the revolution. It was bollocks. Everything got hung up because George from Workers' Power wouldn't agree. And George was the only person I ever met from Workers' Power. We had the Anarchist Communist Federation, and there were two of them. One of them was an anarchist and one was a communist. And they always, they always wanted to have a committee. I don't remember squatters ever having. We didn't have committees. We just did it, which was one of the reasons I think was good about it. Yeah.
The local squatters acquired the freehold through squatters' rights.
Oh, sorry. Could you say that again?
Do you know if any of the squatters got the freehold through squatters' rights?
Yeah.
I know that there were people in Brixton who did, but I don't know if anybody in Hackney ever managed to.
Brown Road, they somebody became co-ops, and I think they ended up owning
In where?
Brown Road.
Brown Road. Oh yeah, that makes sense. Ellingthorpe Road, yeah. So, but I think those were co-ops, and then they maybe bought them out or something. But I know in Lambeth there were people who actually had it for 12 years.
Yeah, I think there was a kind of, I don't know if it was a law, but if you'd been in a property 10 years, was it?
12.
Well, 12, because you guys know what. And so yeah, there was this squatters' rights thing, so absolutely. But we personally didn't know many people that had been in one place for that long. But we did hear of it, yeah.
Thanks. You have.
That was my question. I went to some of the gigs in the restaurants, but I wasn't involved in this. I came a bit late to the party because I was involved very heavily in housing co-ops after they had become committee central. I was wondering how such a, as you say, an organic movement has transformed into something that made In Quiet Flows the Dawn look like a short story. If you remember when you get to page 300 and they're having the 700 workers meeting. And it came from licensed squats, forming something. I was just wondering if anyone knew anything, had been part of that evolution. It was an evolution.
I don't know about you three, but I had no. The stuff I was saying about people who got licences was, history to me. During the 80s, I don't remember anybody getting. Although I know that it did happen in Ellingthorpe Road, but I wasn't involved in that. But I think one of the problems with an organic organisation is that you can get to a certain point where you maybe need something more formal because you're taking on legal responsibilities, for example. So once you become a housing co-op, somebody's got to be the name that's on the checkbook or what have you. And I'm not saying you can't do that through an organic organisation, but I think the things that we were involved in didn't last long enough to get to that point. So, the Blue House was for 2 years, Lee House was about 18 months. That was the sort of life cycle, because in the 80s, in my experience, certainly in Hackney, the council weren't interested in reaching an accommodation with squatters. They weren't interested in giving licences, and they would evict people from houses that then stayed empty and either fell down or got squatted again. So, to my mind, that made no sense. You could understand it if you've got the money to do it up, but the first place I squatted in Stoke Newington, we were kicked out in December 1984, and it was still empty in 1987, but the roof had collapsed by then, and I think it got sold to a housing association who did do it up. So the council wasted that money evicting us, because in that time I'd squatted another 7 different places that they evicted me from. So, sorry, I'm getting off the topic, but yeah, I don't think the things we were involved in lasted long enough to get to the point where that organic organisation has to adapt to
some
fit in.
people I was visiting to see if they were eligible for us to rehouse them were in squats, and one of the criteria was, are you in imminent danger of someone kicking your door in, basically?
Which was always a possibility. Oh, sorry, yes.
I was squatting in Hackney in the 70s, just a normal squatter. And then in 78, 79, we set up a little housing co-op, and in fact, all Hackney Community House in October, short-term leases. And in fact, the council were cooperative. And in fact, money came in, and we got a very hands-on architect who gave advice about how to do joists and so on. And we had that for 4 years, and it was an okay arrangement. And I'm never sure to this day exactly where the money came from. And there was a kind of umbrella group called SLUG, Short Life Users.
Yeah, Short Life Users Group.
And it worked quite incredibly well. And yeah, sure, no one agreed on anything, but the 3 people we chosen to write the checkbooks, we trusted them, and nothing much went wrong, you know. And it was a very interesting experience.
Yeah, and I mean, I must admit, I didn't really I mean, you know, this wasn't the fruit of years of research, although I read your stuff online, actually, I recognise it, which was great. And yeah, I didn't really get to the bottom of why exactly in the 80s there seemed to be a very different attitude to what the local government had taken a different approach in the 70s, but I'm not sure why that changed. Maybe this forthcoming book in December will probably have a chapter that explains it. Are we out of time now? So, thanks a lot for coming. It was really nice to. I think it was nice, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.